Hello and welcome to another episode of the Tyndale House podcast. We are now in the second episode of a series on New Testament manuscripts, and today I'm joined by Dirk Jongkind, who is our Vice Principal for Academic Things here at Tyndale House. In our first episode in this series, we just looked at some of the broader questions of manuscripts in the New Testament, and one of the things we talked about was that there are some basic categories of manuscripts. There are the papyri, written on papyrus from fairly early on, and then later when manuscripts are produced on parchment, they're categorized as majuscules in all uppercase letters, and then later minuscule with lowercase letters. So have a look at episode 1 if you want to gen up on those things if you haven't seen it or listened to it already. Want to follow on from there in this episode to talk about what does a manuscript actually look like, because some people listening to this will be familiar with them, but many others will maybe have only seen a couple of pictures of them and not really have much sense of what you get on the page. So what have we got? What are we looking at in those different kinds of manuscripts?
It is actually remarkable that the New Testament manuscripts we have are, with one or two exceptions, all actually books. So we open a book, we flip the pages, etc. And as far as the evidence goes back into the 2nd century, Christians always had those books rather than rolls. Most literature was written on rolls. So whenever you have a New Testament manuscript, you have either a book with multiple pages, and then it looks pretty like any ordinary book, although handwritten, or you have only a fragment of one page. And to be honest, many of our oldest manuscripts are, well, kind of elevated credit card size type of thing.
Yeah,
so
right.
You don't get much text from those. A little bit of text on the front and then a little bit of text on the back. But there are those fragments without any or hardly any complete words in them.
And why is that? I know we talked about that a little bit in the first episode. But
So the most of the papyri were all dug up on rubbish heaps of Egypt. And the fact that we have a little fragment is almost something to celebrate it. But we know that it is only a little fragment of a larger book. So if you have a look at one of our oldest New Testament manuscripts, in New Testament jargon called P52.
this is the John Rylands.
John Rylands, discovered in Manchester, of course, in a box with papyri from Egypt, but nevertheless identified in Manchester. It has a little bit of John 18 on the front, a little bit of John 19 on the back, but it is only 5 lines and then 5 incomplete lines of text. So in a sense, you need dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of thousands of those fragments before you would have a complete New Testament.
Right.
But it's probably just a manuscript of the Gospel of John and only one tiny bit of one page being preserved, dug up from the rubbish heaps.
So would that gospel have been thrown away, or do you think the original gospel would have been damaged and then the bits were thrown away? How does it end up on a rubbish heap?
It's a very good question, actually, and we don't really know. Probably the whole manuscript was thrown away because it was falling apart. That is the most likely explanation.
Right.
But then we have very few reasonably complete papyri manuscripts. We have a few, actually. That's some of the bigger ones where we have... There's one papyrus of the Gospel of John, P66, which has the first 14 chapters nearly complete. I mean, take it with a grain of salt, but a lot of text from there. And then on the second half, there are the odd fragment here and there. But there we have multiple pages with quite a substantial bit of text.
Right. And the edges go big just because they're the most vulnerable, are they? Or they get damp or they just get abraded?
Papyrus as a material is very brittle. Right. It breaks easily and therefore it just disintegrates, basically. So that is the biggest problem with papyrus. Parchment has a tendency to rot away because it's also organic material, but then animal skin, and that basically falls apart in the wrong circumstances. But then parchment in itself can survive for a very long time.
Right. And that's why our best manuscripts are parchment ones rather than papyrus ones?
At least most extensive manuscripts, that would be parchment rather than papyrus.
Yes, by best I meant extensive. There's various ways of understanding best, I guess. Okay. And you say that the codex, the book, came in 2nd century?
No,
or earlier than that? We
have the first literary mention of a codex of the book in the epigrams of the Latin poet Martial. Martial wrote around 60s or 70s AD, and he has a little poem, little whatever it is, epigram, where he advises his public to buy those little handy books that are written on parchment and have individual pages. And they are so handy because you can read a book with holding only one hand up. Now, with a roll, of course, you need to have two hands. But with those nice little books, codex, you only needed one hand. So they were ideal travel books.
Right. And we have no idea where they were first developed or why?
Must have been around that time. And in the 2nd century, the codex in non-Christian circles was quite often used for more technical material, sort of medical handbooks or other such thing. But literature needed to be written properly on a roll.
Ah, right. Okay. Yeah. So was that... again, we probably don't fully know the answers for this, but is that because the literature needed to be on a scroll because that's the way it had always been done, and there's a sense of being in the tradition, whereas for a medical handbook, the ease of access of a book form is really very useful to you if you want to be able to look things up.
That indeed has been sort of the speculation about, but we don't have any contemporary kind of account of one over the other.
Right.
But it is indeed interesting that Christianity is a very early adopter of this technology.
Yes. So the people who were writing down the Gospels and Paul's letters, it was presumably for them, they felt that this is the most useful way of writing this down.
Yeah. So hard evidence we have from the oldest New Testament manuscripts from the 2nd century. So that still leaves a gap of a century or so to Paul himself. But we have in one of Paul's letters in Timothy a reference to, we asked Timothy, if you come, bring the books and the parchments. And the word for parchments there is membrane, where our word membrane comes from, which seems to indicate a folded book. So it may be one of the very earliest Christian references to books, and Paul in that case would already identify that.
Wow. Presumably he wouldn't have sent his letters in a book form because they wouldn't be long enough to put on multiple pages. He would have just written them on, or the scribe would have written them for him, perhaps, in some cases, just on one sheet or a couple
multiple sheets, yes. Romans is quite a long letter,
True.
so you would need quite a few. Probably a roll, most likely, but we don't know for sure. Perhaps Paul liked to use that. We don't know.
Yeah. So Paul's letters were sent to individual churches, but obviously there are a collection of them in the New Testament. We talk about the Pauline letters, the Johannine letters. At what point did they start being collected into a bundle, perhaps circulated as a collection of Paul's letters?
It's a very good question, and we have very concrete evidence for the actual collection of Paul's letters. Probably the oldest reference to the sort of collection of Paul's letters comes from 2 Peter, at the end of 2 Peter, where Peter refers to a beloved brother Paul, who has written the same things about which Peter is talking in his letters to you, or as he has written to you. So there Peter seems to know about multiple letters written to the same audience as he writes to in 2 Peter.
Yeah, right.
And then he adds to it, as he has written in all his letters. So he knew about not just those letters written to the same audience, but also other letters. So there seems to be an understanding already that even in those days, the letters were combined. And also Paul himself makes a big thing out of that. He is preaching one and the same thing to every church. And he encourages the Colossians to read the letter to the Laodiceans, etc. So there is that sense of a letter is perhaps a little bit more than just something written to a single church, but the physical collection and how it works, we don't really know. A very attractive theory is that ultimately Paul's letters, as we have them, do not go back to the receiving churches sort of bundling the letters, but Paul himself bundling the letters of which he kept a copy in his own archives.
Oh, wow. Well, that's an interesting idea, isn't it? But then my understanding is that writing a letter in the ancient world was quite an expensive process because of the materials and the time involved, especially if you were using a professional scribe to do it. Could he really, would they really have been able to invest the time and money in 2 sets of materials and the time of the scribe doubled up in order to write 2 copies? That seems a little surprising, but...
At the same time, when you look at Acts, for example, and the description of Paul's movement, well, unless he was traveling in captivity, he seemed to be traveling happily all around. Okay, on occasion working for his own maintenance or working with his own hands as he did in Corinth. But otherwise he seemed to be traveling around, and not just him alone, but always with a group of people. So I don't think the lack of resources bit is something that is suggested by what we find.
Yeah, sure. And I suppose it's always possible that he actually is writing his own copy and reading out what he's writing while another scribe, is it Tertius, the scribe for Romans? Yeah. So Tertius is writing the proper copy, while Paul could be writing his own. Those kinds of things are also possible, I guess.
That's right.
There's all sorts of ways. Yeah, interesting. So when do we first? What's the earliest evidence we have of collected New Testament documents, whether Gospels, letters, or whatever? When do they start being amalgamated into a single codex?
Yeah. That must have happened somewhere within the 2nd century, at least on a substantial scale. It is only, of course, by the end of the 3rd century that bookbinding technology had developed sufficiently to have a whole New Testament as one physical copy.
Yep.
But before that, from the beginning of the 3rd century, we have a papyrus manuscript with almost all the letters of Paul in one physical volume. And in the 2nd century, probably, we get the names of the 4 Gospels established. And it is always the Gospel according to Matthew, according to Mark, according to the others. And that seems to suggest that the Gospels were already seen as some sort of a unity, the Gospel, and then the according to someone with,
Yep.
is a name given to the collection, and it is not the name given to an individual book.
Yes, right. Okay, yeah, that's interesting. Now, when I was growing up, I understood that when these manuscripts were written, that Greek was just written continuously. There was not even gaps between words, and it turns out that this is all somewhat dodgy thinking that I was under many misapprehensions. Tell us about what the text itself actually looks like.
Well, you were not that far out. I mean, as a teenager who thinks about what we call script, whatever it is, continuous script, in the sense of without word breaks, etc. So in general, word breaks between on a line are not standard. Sometimes you see that the scribe clearly pauses a little bit between one phrase and the next phrase, so you get a slightly bigger gap. Mm-hmm. But it was not necessary.
Okay.
So the picture of it was one very long word without interruption is by and large true.
Okay.
Though there is some punctuation already there in the earliest manuscripts.
Now that was a complete surprise to me to discover that there was actually some punctuation, because I just believed that this was a later invention. So when did punctuation come in, and what kind of punctuation do we see?
The most common punctuation you will see is a dot roughly in the middle, so our full stop, but then a little bit lifted up. Mm-hmm. And in the earliest days, that was the jack of all trades punctuation, could mean anything, sort of, but just a pause. Now, the grammarians describe a system with 3 dots on different heights, where the lowest dot is the shortest pause in reading, and the highest dot is the longest pause in reading. But again, these punctuation marks are determined by the reading experience. So whether or not you pause a short while or a longer while.
Yes.
And of course, the reading is indeed punctuation in a sense.
Yeah.
And probably even if we punctuate something in speech, that is emphasis, it is pausing, etc.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it's not that strange. And then there are the paragraph marks.
Right.
Now, when we think paragraph, we think modern paragraph. And by and large, paragraphing in older texts functions similar but also different. Paragraphing is just a very heavy punctuation mark. Mm-hmm. So you can have a new paragraph to emphasize the importance of the words that follow. So if you have a story of Jesus in conflict with the Pharisees, then Jesus is going to deliver the punchline at the end of the story, and just the words of Jesus there are marked off as a paragraph, because that's where the natural focus falls.
Wow. Yeah. And how is that paragraph marked? Is it the same as a paragraph is marked in modern text?
No, slightly different. So we often have a blank line and an indentation.
Yeah.
In Greek, you could have a blank space, not necessarily a blank line, but it could be sort of a remaining blank line. And then the first word of the next full line sticks a little bit out into the left margin.
Okay.
It's called ekthesis. So it projects a little bit to the left, and that gives it very kind of visual effect.
Yeah, right. So going back to the continuous text, it just relied on the skill of the reader to pass where the words began and ended, presumably. And how much potential is there for misreading because of that?
We have examples where we find variation between manuscripts that is most likely the result of wrong word division. For example, in 2 Thessalonians, there is a little bit of discussion whether Paul talks about first fruit or from the beginning. And those have to do whether or not the first bit is a separate preposition from the beginning,
right,
or a first fruit, and then it is written as one word.
Okay, right.
So you can have on occasion those variants. But it is also clear that people still thought in words rather than in syllables or meaningless individual letters.
Right.
Because we get quite a few word order variants. Now, in a word order variant can only happen if you think in words and therefore kind of mix up the words.
Yeah, okay, right, yeah.
But when you have a text without that many word divisions, the only way how you can make sense of it is actually pronounce it. And when you hear the syllables sort of roll out of your own mouth, then the words are formed, etc. Especially if you have quite a phonetic script, where the actual letters on the page resemble the sounds that you are supposed to make.
Right, yes. And reading, of course, was a vocal activity. It wasn't a silent activity. Is it Ambrose who's the first person to be said to be reading without his lips moving and causing a bit of surprise?
That's quite an explicit comment about him.
Yeah,
yes, that's right.
This extraordinary man reading without his lips moving. and now it seems almost odd if somebody was to read aloud to themselves, and yet presumably that was the natural practice.
Yeah,
so
make
that
for
helps.
a very noisy train.
Oh goodness, yes. What else do we see in the manuscript itself and in the writings? So you talked about how the text is the paragraph divisions, punctuation marks. I mean, it's a very limited set of punctuation marks. Are there others beside the dot, maybe?
Well, one of the things you won't see is a distinction between uppercase and lowercase.
Because it's either all majuscule or it's all minuscule.
That's right. So names in that sense were not marked out by anything.
Right.
However, the iota, the I, the E sound, often has 2 dots above it to mark that it is its own syllable and not part of a diphthong, something else. The same can happen with the upsilon as well.
Right.
There are a couple of words, and maybe we'll talk about this later as well, called the sacred names, or in Latin, the nomina sacra, where for the names Jesus and Lord and Christ, only the first and last letter were written, and then with a line above them.
Yep. And there's a very fine article about that on the Tyndale House website written by yourself.
Now that you mention it. And also numbers could be written either spelled out in full or in letters. So the alpha would be a 1, the iota would be 10, or kappa would be 20. And so you could write a number with just writing down the letter abbreviation. And again, you would put a line over it.
I see, yeah. And were these lines used for anything else?
Not that I'm aware of. Yes, sometimes for the end of a line where you have an N sound, and then instead of writing the N, you can just write a line above the final letter, which still happens in English medieval manuscripts as well. So, so that survived a very, very long time.
Wow.
But when it comes to the actual block of text, that's about the major sort of things. But of course, around the text, there is space for all sorts of other interesting things.
That's what I was about to ask about. So tell us about the marginalia.
So one of the things is you would often have a running title on top of the page. So it would say, to the Romans, or according to Mark, so that you knew what sort of book you were having. Page numbers happen very, very rarely. It's actually a tiny minority that has page numbers, which I find slightly odd because I find page numbers remarkably helpful. Sometimes there is a section numbering for some sort of a reference system. Within the Gospels, the church father Eusebius in the early 4th century designed a system that you could find similar passages in the parallel Gospels. So if you have the feeding of the 5,000, which occurs in all 4 Gospels, then they would be marked with a sort of letter code in the margin, so that you could easily find the places in the Gospels where that story happened.
So how did you reference the locations then? Because there's no chapter and verse numbers.
No. So Eusebius used or designed, but he probably took it over from somebody else, basically a section numbering of each of the Gospels separately. So Mark 1, 2, 300 something, etc. And that for each of the Gospels. And then he had tables on a separate piece of paper, or a separate piece of parchment, where these are the sections that occur in all 4. So column for Mark, Mark 1 corresponds to Luke something, to John so what. And so he went through each of the sections and listed the parallels. So one section in Matthew could have multiple parallels in another gospel if it was sort of duplicated there. So that's quite a sophisticated system, which betrays that there was already comparative study going on. It's not just one gospel, but you try to see what's happening in each of the gospels and put them together and go from one to the other.
That's very fascinating. And you also, in the margins, what you would have corrections being made with.
Yes.
Sometimes
corrections are a tricky issue. Sometimes corrections in the margin were made by the original scribe. That's great.
And you can recognize that by the handwriting.
Often you do. Sometimes they are a later reader. And that later reader may be 50 years later, maybe 200 years later, maybe 1,000 years later. So in a manuscript, you can have almost a whole archaeological excavation of all sorts of layers on top of one another, and sometimes interacting with one another. So more recent ones interacting with later ones. And then it is quite a tricky business to unpack all the layers of the onion to see what the first scribe wrote.
And how do you go about doing that and figuring out what the order because of changes in the style of writing, or sometimes is it just guesswork?
I wouldn't call it guesswork.
Of course. There's no guesswork.
Sort of professional pride here.
Professional guesswork.
Imagination, creative, informed imagination is probably a better way of describing it. Handwriting style do change. My parents wrote different than I do. And my children have, again, a different style of handwriting. And that happened also in the official book hands, the fonts they were writing in those days. So that is one way of doing it. But then, of course, it is the physical layout of a correction. You respond to something that's already there. Something is rubbed out and then written over. So in most cases, you can have a fairly good impression of what must have happened. But then sometimes a scribe or a later reader, when they encountered a difficult word, would sort of write an explanation in the margin. You have an old-fashioned word, so you write the newer word, more modern word, in the margin.
Can you think of any examples off the top of your head?
There is an example in 2 Timothy where I think Paul talks about sort of healthy doctrine, where one word for health is, I think, replaced with another one. And we know that because we know the dictionary where that example comes from. And then, of course, it is a problem. The next person who is going to copy this manuscript,
which word
he comes across this alternative word in the margin. And at that point is not sure, is this a correction or is this an explanation? and it may be misread as a correction, and therefore the newer word is put into the main text.
So is that one of the reasons why manuscripts start diverging from each other?
Yes, although this particular scenario probably did not happen that often, but it is a factor.
Yeah, right. What other kind of mistakes do scribes typically make?
Scribes make any possible mistake imaginable. There is a great example in the genealogy of Jesus in Luke, with its 70 names, is quite often written in 2 columns under one another. But what happens then...
Sorry, so most of the text is written in 1 column, but the genealogy becomes 2 columns.
That's right. Otherwise it takes a little bit too much space.
Yeah. Okay.
But then scribes got confused. Is the genealogy first top to down, first column, and then top down, second column, or do I need to read horizontally? So we have beautiful messing up things going on there. You have a lot of I skip, either you skip forward or you skip backwards.
Okay, and just duplicate or miss things out then.
That's right.
Yeah.
The other day I heard a great example about the letter of Hebrews, which can occur in various places in sort of among Paul's letters. So in manuscript terms, Hebrews is always part of Paul's letters. Whether or not it is real, for manuscript terms, the issue is clear. So often Hebrews comes between Thessalonians and Timothy, but sometimes also at the end of the pastoral letters. And here we had one scribe who had written Thessalonians and then Hebrews, and I think a bit of Timothy. Another scribe takes over, writes Timothy, Titus, Philemon, and then again Hebrews. So in this particular manuscript, Hebrews occurs twice, once before and once after the pastoral epistles.
That's quite a lot of additional copying, isn't it?
It is.
Yes, you can just imagine his face when he goes back into the common room and says, "I've just finished Hebrews," and his colleague says, "I did that a year ago." Yeah. Right. Interesting the 2 column things, because some of certainly later manuscripts like the Codex Sinaiticus are written in 3 or 4 columns. How normal was that? Was 1 column the norm and 2 columns, 3 columns sometimes? Or
for the more luxury manuscripts, 2 columns became the norm almost. So 2 fairly narrow columns makes for easy public reading with quite a bit of space around it. And of course, still many of the Bibles we print today tend to have 2 columns. It's the only book we use regularly, at least I hope regularly, which has multiple columns. I think. Dictionaries, yeah. That's regularly used, okay. But then Codex Sinaiticus has normally 4 columns for prose text, but then 2 columns for poetic text. Codex Vaticanus has 3 columns. That's very rare. 4 and 3 columns is very rare. But it's either 1 column as a normal book or 2.
Okay. Great. Is there anything else that we should know about what manuscripts look like? I mean, there's so many things we could discuss, but...
Well, we like our manuscripts with pictures in it. But surprisingly, within the Greek New Testament tradition, we only have very few manuscripts with extensive pictures. So there is one beautiful, it's called a purple manuscript of Matthew, which has all sorts of very nice scenes from the Old Testament sort of painted in. But that is really an exception. In gospel manuscripts, you can have an image of the author, so a kind of sort of icon type of depiction of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But otherwise, Greek New Testament manuscripts are reasonably sober. There is not much ornamentation going on.
Right.
The Latin tradition in that sense is much more fun when it comes to visual attractiveness.
Yeah, I remember we think of medieval illuminated manuscripts and they're beautiful. How far back does that tradition of drawing on the manuscripts go?
So in the Latin West, it goes back quite far. But in the sort of the Greek East, it was always much more restrained than that.
Right.
At least in our surviving material.
Yeah. And that purple manuscript, why is that a purple? Is it written on something purple? Or written?
It was parchment which was made purple for aesthetic reason. And then you can write on it with gold and silver ink.
Wow.
So all the names of Jesus and Christ were written with gold and some of the other names in silver. And for the rest, it was a sort of other light ink on top of it. And that was pure to show that it was luxury stuff.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, that's fascinating. So, yeah, there are so many more questions I want to ask, but we need to draw this to a close, I think. Thank you very much, Dirk.
It's been a pleasure again.
I think in our next episode, we're going to be talking about some of the most significant manuscripts of the different periods. So we'll look forward to that. But yeah, thank you very much. Please do join us again. Rate and review us and all that kind of stuff. Please tell others about the podcast because that's how other people get to know about us and hear these great things from Dirk and Nelson when he's back with us. Thanks very much.